Jesus, the Buddha, and Moses all walked into a room. Kind of sounds like the start of a joke, right? But they actually have some important things to talk about. What is real? What went wrong? And how do we fix it? I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. My opening episodes introduced John and then the Buddha, and an analogy of aliens describing a truck. And then when I brought those two together for a conversation, we ended up focusing on questions about what is real and what went wrong or what is wrong, because in the Buddha's mind, it didn't go wrong, it always just was, and then how to fix it. And I can distill all that down to this when I combine those two together in a summary. Love and all-encompassing compassion are what is really real, and the fix for what is wrong is to receive and to become love and compassion. Now, I'm not going to repeat everything in those episodes that led me to that. If you haven't come across those yet, I'll send you back there. But Jesus and the Buddha have been the two most influential friends in shaping how I see the world and reality, and in shaping how I live. It made sense to begin there because of that. But I've been working with the material concerning Moses for almost 50 years, so that's where I went next. And by the way, there still will be three more friends whom I will turn to in the order in which I was introduced to them, not necessarily in the order of their influence upon me. And that means that after I do what I will explain at the end of this episode next, after that will come Muhammad and the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and then the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. But here we are, after 30 episodes, with Moses on his way over here to my house, as it were, to join the conversation with Jesus and the Buddha. And all through the Moses episodes, I have paused here and there to point out places where, as I put it, Jesus and the Buddha helped me to pick out the bones that I've found in the Moses soup, pointed out some of the ways Moses might understand what's real and what went wrong and how to fix it as well along the way. So in some ways, I've already begun to touch on some of the things that I will try to illuminate further here. But now I'm actually getting the three of them intentionally into the same room, getting a chance to hear more, including what I think Moses would say to them about the three questions, which I haven't hinted at yet. Again, what's real? What's wrong? How do we fix it? So we're starting with what is real. I primarily focused my explorations on the dimension of this question that had to do with what might be called ultimate reality. But in this conversation, I also will include, to some extent at least, how these three friends view the world of things and beings, what some might call nature or the creation or the cosmos. But we're going to start with ultimate reality. And in John's presentation of Jesus, ultimate reality, the really real, is God. But who or what is that? My way of summarizing John's answer was that the divine nature is towardsness, into-ness, embrace, openness, and humility. And that 5-word summary got further summarized into one word in a letter that also bears the name of John. God is love. And in the same letter, the author makes it clear that the clearest indicator that a person has come to know who God is, and so has come to know ultimate reality, is that they also love. The one who loves is born of God because God is love, that letter writes. In other words, they share in the divine nature, and that was also described in the prologue to John's Gospel, verses 1 through 18 of chapter 1, that were the focus of my Jesus According to John episodes. Ultimate reality is love. Life is all about becoming love and sharing in that divine nature or in the nature of ultimate reality. What about the Buddha? I noted in those episodes, especially according to the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, that the end or purpose of the Buddha's Dhamma, or teaching, is to cultivate an all-encompassing compassion for all things and all beings. That kind of compassion is the nature of what is called, in that tradition, the Buddha mind. And as a result, even though the term ultimate reality is not the way the Buddha would have spoken, all-encompassing compassion seems to be about as close to an equivalent to that as I can get, at least in this comparative conversation. So ultimate reality can be described as all-encompassing compassion, and the aim of life is to cultivate and share in that same reality, cultivating and even becoming compassion. So in both John and in the Buddha, what we see is that ultimate reality and the aim of life are deeply interconnected. What about Moses? Well, like John, Moses begins with God. In the beginning, God created. And it's clear that although Moses doesn't have a word for ultimate reality, if he did, God would be that. The books of Moses describe God in narrative form, not in the kind of poetic and therefore abstract way that John 1 did. So some of what comes out of that narrative are things like this. God creates. God intervenes in order to correct injustice and other issues, and acts in what I've called co-agency. I'm going to deliver Israel. I'm sending you to do that. I want to bless all peoples. I'm going to use Abraham and Abraham's descendants to do that. But also in the books of Moses, God argues and chooses and smells and hears and sees and speaks and remembers and gets angry and punishes. God can be cruel and God can be compassionate in that narrative. God is portrayed in a very human, personal way, sometimes even embarrassingly so for some. But at the same time, Moses experiences God as Yahweh. I am who I am, this mysterious, undefinable one. Both the Buddha and the Jesus of John include the idea that our lives can be shaped in conformity to that ultimate reality, as we've seen, becoming love or becoming compassion. That's not necessarily, at least directly, a feature in Moses. However, I would note, and my processing of John and Buddha helped me even see this, to be honest, that Genesis 1 speaks of human beings having been shaped by God in God's own image and likeness. Now, I've always seen that, but the implications of that for me include the fact that while we might not notice this unless reading with John and the Buddha, and therefore asking the question is, does Moses even have an idea about sharing in the divine nature? This fact that the books of Moses describe us being made in God's image mean that human nature is meant to at least reflect and therefore share the image of God. We're to be somehow like and in the likeness and image of ultimate reality, in the image and likeness of God, according to Moses. Now, what would they say to each other? I'm going to let Moses speak first this time. I think that's only fair. And I think the essence of his comments to John and the Buddha would be actually very much the same. I can imagine him turning to them and saying something like this. You guys are both way too abstract. In my experience, God speaks and acts and appears and commands and does things and feels things, lots of things, and says things. God can be argued with and bargained with. There's a relationship, an interaction, though I admit, Moses might say, it can be one in which you're not always sure what God is doing or why. And after all, I've come to know that God is who God is. I am who I am, after all. John, you speak of darkness and light, but they just seem like ideas. To me, the way God shed light in the darkness was actually very real and tangible. God made stars and the sun and the moon. And Buddha, the idea of all-encompassing compassion is even more abstract than John's description of God as love. Of course, both the Buddha and the Jesus of John would have things to say to Moses, and not just in response to what Moses said to them. So, for example, Buddha might say, Moses, your ideas about the personal, quote-unquote, aspects of the divine are probably grounded in false ideas of a self. I won't cast any doubt on what you say about what you experienced, Moses, but perceptions and ideas and experiences and interpretations of perceptions and ideas and experiences are all formulations that are bundled together, aggregated from constantly changing experiences and illusions and false assumptions. Now, I catch glimpses of compassion in the way you describe this one you call God, but some of what you say God did or told you to do are things that if a human being did or commanded them, we would say are unjust and violent, springing from a root of anger that actually needs to be eradicated. It's part of why we suffer, that root of anger. And Jesus might add, I agree with the Buddha on this point, Moses. Your portrayal of God as violent, even vengeful, is nothing like the divine being I experience or taught. Yes, there is an exacting, piercing light in the divine, which reveals what's wrong inside of human hearts if they're willing to come to that light. But that light and that truth flow from love, from the desire to show human beings what's wrong. And that's also motivated by love. It's so that they can be cured. Moses, you described God as a hardener of hearts, one who hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would disobey, and then God could punish him. Moses, that's not love. It's not the one I came to experience as love, as even Abba, Father, in a tender way. All right, well, what does Kevin think about all this? When I read the books of Moses through the lens of Jesus and the Buddha, I can't imagine either of them accepting everything we see here in those books of Moses, and I can't accept it all either. Both of them would point to what I've called bones in the soup. Both would ask, and I too ask, if a God whose very nature is love, or if all-encompassing compassion, in Buddha's words, would cause or approve of a flood that would kill the vast majority of human beings, or order a father to sacrifice his son, or kill the firstborn Egyptian sons by their own hand, in other words, by God's own hand, or harden a man's heart and then punish him for having a hard heart. It's clear that Buddha and the Jesus of John would both say no to that. And so, with them, I say no also. But there is some good soup in Moses for me. Moses' experience of the very personal nature of the divine is important in my own experience of the divine. The history of that now in my 68 years of life, not all of that in relationship or at least conscious relationship with God, but the personal nature of this God who I could describe as a living God has been very important to me, and I see that very real, even in ways that I have to correct. I see it as being very real for Moses. I know there's rougher edges in the divine personality that Moses describes, and those need to get smoothed out, but I smooth them out and correct them by applying the lenses of the Jesus of John and the Buddha. As a Jesus follower, I interpret what to accept and not accept in Moses through my best understanding of what Jesus would accept or reject. And as a Buddha meditator, I'm growing in self-awareness, including the awareness of how easily self-deception and illusion can affect my assumptions about many things, including about God. I appreciate the Buddha's wariness of assuming that what we see and think and feel all equates to reality, and our false assumptions even about ourselves as selves. That's another insight of the Buddha's that I really appreciate. These all provide sort of checks and balances for me in my own life, including the way that I view my relationship with God, how I interpret what I think I might be experiencing as ideas or inspirations or inclinations that I might say come from God, quote unquote. I do speak of having a relationship with God, but I'm also aware of how easy it is to misinterpret, jump to conclusions about how I would interpret things. Frankly, to be honest, I think that's something that the Buddha would talk to Moses about as well if they were actually in the same room. I think he would also talk about a way that Moses could check how he interpreted his experiences and impressions and assumptions, providing Moses a way to distinguish his own voice and preferences from what is the divine, what is real. Jesus' caution to Moses, were they to have been together, I think would have been focused on a pretty single criterion. Whatever isn't love, pure and simple, pure and clean, isn't from God, which would cut to the bone of some of Moses' interpretations and actions. Putting these three together, these three friends, in my own way, drawing now on bits and pieces from over the course of 30 episodes, I would describe ultimate reality as this mysterious reality of the divine, of all-encompassing compassion, love, a living God who's personal but not a person, not a self, is I am who I am, not existing in isolation, not existing in the sense we normally use that term at all relative to saying God exists. Because if ultimate reality is the source of all existence, then it can't exist the way other things do. The divine mystery is a plural singular and a singular plural. Ultimate reality is ultimately a mystery beyond description, but which or who can be experienced and known. A knowable unknown and an unknown known. That's ultimate reality, in my best way to try to summarize what I get from the three. Well, that's ultimate reality. I said I would also talk a bit in this one about what we might talk about as the aspect of reality that's made up of the world of things and animals and plants and people. For John and Moses, nature, the cosmos, are created by this divine being, created by the divine being according to Moses and through God according to John. If we want to say that they're real, in other words, that the world of things is real, or even that you and I are real, it would be in a secondary sense, a dependent sense, not an ultimate sense. In the Buddha's worldview, there is no primal creation. There is no origin story. The world just is, in one sense, and always has been. But there is a huge caveat to that. The world we say exists is actually not the world itself, but our perception of it, or the intermingling of whatever it is exists with our perceptions. Our experiences and formulated descriptions are not the thing itself. Our formulated descriptions are dependent on all sorts of other experiences and formulations, including those of others that we learn from. And what about Kevin? Well, in terms of how we experience the world of nature and the cosmos, I think there's no doubt the Buddha's correct. It is impossible to separate things, quote unquote, people, objects, etc., and the experiences, our experiences of those things. We can't separate them out into neat boxes. All we know of things is through our experience of them and our interpretations of them. So perceptions do really connect with things outside our perception. I agree with John and Moses here. There really are things other than us, whatever we are, that our perceptions are and descriptions do connect with. But our perceptions are never purely that thing that we're perceiving. And I agree there with the Buddha. Perception and experience and knowledge and things are inextricably connected, and in that sense, things, quote unquote, are and are not real in and of themselves, apart from the perceiver, all at the same time, both and. The question of origins, was there a time when things began to be? Was there a beginning? According to the Buddha, no. According to Moses, there seems to be, and according to John, one might assume so. So are these in contradiction here? And how do I process this? In the first of the books of Moses, the book of Genesis, there is apparently a clear starting point. After all, Genesis opens with the famous words, "In the beginning God made the heavens and the earth." There's no indication about when that beginning took place. And if, as some quantum physicists would say, time is one of the results or effects of the cosmos and not a thing in and of itself, then a divine being would be, quote unquote, prior to time, and would have conceived of and imagined all of this that we see as this prior to time, quote unquote. And at the same time, pun intended there, what they imagine would be inseparable from what is. In a sense, they are pre-perceiving the things that we then perceive through our own perceptions. And that, whatever that divine being is imagining, is inseparable from what then becomes, just as our perceptions of things now are inseparable from those things themselves. Meaning it's not inconceivable that there is not some real starting point to the world. It all existed, quote unquote, prior to existing. It existed in the mind and imagination, if you will, of the divine. Or to put it the way John did, everything came to be through God. Except there's no then from the point of view of an eternal being. There's no when things began, or a then that was the beginning. At least that's how I would imagine it. But I've never been an eternal being, so I don't actually know. Perhaps one way to integrate these three is to say that from our human point of view, from inside time, from inside the system, so to speak, the cosmos had a beginning. But if there is a being that is not inside that system and thus knows everything from outside the system, including outside of time, then from the point of view of such a being, there would be no beginning, since there is no time except within the system. In other words, maybe what seems to be a contradiction between these three is a difference in frame, perspective, point of view. A quick clarification here, just to be clear. I don't want to give the impression that I think John, Moses, and the Buddha are all saying exactly the same thing, or that they're going to be harmonizable in every instance. But I do believe that they're all touching the same truck, and that when I listen to each of them, they each help me see different aspects of reality and time and the world and the cosmos and what I'm calling the divine. I don't see them to be mutually exclusive. I don't see them to be always in total agreement, but I do see them mutually additive and enlightening as I process them. Well, I want to turn to the question of what's gone wrong. And for me, that question arises due to the fact that for John, what is real is a God whose nature is love itself. And in the Buddha, all-encompassing compassion is ultimate reality. And in Moses, it's a God who made a good world. But the reality we know around us and within us, and that's an important part, within us too, is so obviously full of data that is not like any of those descriptions of what is real that it begs the question, how did we end up like this? What's wrong? I'll start with John. One of the passages I looked at from John chapter 1 was in the 5th verse. The light shines in the darkness, The darkness has not snuffed it out. And then we also looked at a portion of John chapter 3. This is the judgment. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and doesn't come to the light for fear their deeds will be exposed. But whoever does truth, that's my translation, comes towards the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they do has been done in God. Now, there's two aspects of what's wrong here, according to John. There is reference to the things people do, evil things, and he contrasts that with doing truth. It seems to suggest that the core problem is not so much actually just a question of moral or immoral actions, evil and good, but of false and true, lies and truth, or more in line with how I think John actually thought, dishonesty and integrity. And that's confirmed when we look at the second aspect of what's gone wrong, according to John, which is the core issue for John. It's what he calls darkness. The core of what has gone wrong is that we live in denial, hiding from the light, refusing to face ourselves, fearful of being seen and exposed. It's living a lie. And the closest thing that the Jesus of John gets to explaining the origins of this lie is when he speaks elsewhere in the Gospel of John of a being he calls the devil and refers to that being as a liar from the beginning and the father or source of all lies. But how or from where that figure originated, John doesn't say. The opposite of the darkness and the lies, as the text put it, the opposite of hiding in the dark is to come towards the light. That's already starting to hint at the fix, so I'll leave it there. But the reason I mention it here is because coming to the light or hiding in the darkness, all of that is actually what John refers to as judgment. Not some future day when God decides, but the day-to-day ways in which we decide whether we will hide from the light or move towards it. And again, that's already beginning to indicate what the fix is for John. So let me park it there and go to the Buddha to talk about the Buddha's view of what is wrong, which is what he calls craving or attachment, grounded in illusion and delusion. And those are stemming from not seeing things, including ourselves and the self, as they really are. So both John and the Buddha have a way of seeing darkness, you could say, in some form as the core issue in what is wrong. The darkness that the Buddha is talking about is illusion and delusion, which results in suffering, a continuous cycle of attachment rooted in illusion and resulting in more suffering and attachment and more illusion. It's a karmic cycle because what we do and think has consequences for us and for everything. In this way, it is very similar to the darkness that John is talking about as what is ultimately wrong. What about Moses? Moses describes what's gone wrong in narrative form, just as he does everything else. In the archetypical mythic story of Genesis, the first humans are persuaded, we're told, through deceit into an act of disobedience which results in estrangement. And the perpetrator of this deceit is portrayed as an intelligent being, the serpent, a creature that's also made by God. Genesis had already made it clear that everything God made was good, which suggests this creature was probably originally good as well. How or why this being became deceitful is never explained. Just as in John, the origins of the primordial liar is not explained. And in the Buddha's teaching, craving and illusion just have always been, beginningless, and so their origins don't need to be explained. What about Kevin? I find a common theme in these three friends in terms of what has gone wrong, whether it's illusion as a state of being, or deception as the result of an intelligent being, or self-deception in which we lie to ourselves. At the very core, what's gone wrong is some form of untruth, deceit, illusion, darkness, lies, denial. None of them explain the origins, but they're all clear about its reality. As to whether I think there is a personal evil supernatural being, and by supernatural I simply mean one that we don't perceive through our natural senses, or maybe plural beings, I see no reason to assume that there are not other intelligences in existence out there, quote unquote, beyond what we can see or know through our senses. So I see no reason to say there isn't some personal expression of that. It still begs the mystery of where that began. But again, none of the three answer that mystery. All three, of course, describe the results of what's gone wrong, the actions and the attitudes that run through the individual and communal and societal history of humanity and the cosmos. What is wrong is not just at the individual level. It's not just what's wrong with me or you. It's what's wrong with us. Of course, one way we know that something is wrong is that all three friends also have moral and ethical frameworks. It's part of how they measure what has gone wrong. So Moses's Mosaic laws, and in particular summarized in the Ten Commandments, are examples. And much of Buddha's Eightfold Path provides his way of presenting some of this: right action, right speech, right livelihood, for example. As such, the conversation about what is wrong is beginning to suggest some aspects of how my friends will answer the next question: what's the fix? And because, for example, the Ten Commandments or some of the Eightfold Path in Moses and the Buddha help to illuminate what's wrong, not in keeping with those ethical, moral frameworks. And the fix would, one would assume, include becoming in conformity with those things. Summarized that earlier as becoming compassion or becoming love, becoming more fully in keeping with the divine image and likeness. But all of that is already jumping into what is the fix. So let's go there. For John, I referred to this above from John chapter 3. If what's wrong is that we hide in the dark, then the fix is to come towards the light. It is the light, by the way, light that John says enlightens everyone, meaning it's available to everyone if we choose to come to the light. Give up our denial and our resistance, face ourselves, become willing to be seen as we are. To come towards the light requires an exacting self-discovery and self-awareness. And then after that, then what? After coming to the light, then what? In the John episodes, we drew out the reality that humans share in the divine nature as God's begotten children. And thus, if God is love, then, in a sense, becoming love is ultimately the aim of the fix. Or as John put it in a letter that I cited earlier, those who love are born of God, for God is love. But how does that happen? How does becoming love take place in us? There's a clue for John in the passage that speaks of coming to the light, John chapter 3. It says that when someone comes towards the light, something deeper than just what we do is revealed. When we come to the light, John says, what becomes apparent is that none of us has done this on our own. John says that coming to the light and having the good in us revealed reveals that it has been done in God. It's union language, divine and human union, us living in, acting in, becoming love in union with God. Coming to the light, becoming love, is a joint venture of sorts, a process worked in union with the divine and the human. And the most specific paradigmatic example of that union in John is the union of the Word that is God that became human in the historical figure of Jesus. But this union is actually, according to John, available to everyone. Now, Moses had very different language for describing what I'm calling union here. I want to bring him in here rather than jumping all the way to the Buddha. It's worth pointing out. One of the ingredients in the fix, according to Moses, I mentioned this above when I referred to co-agency, is that Moses has a co-agent relationship with God, as an example, in instigating the Exodus events. I am going to deliver my people. I am sending you to do it. I will be with you. There is a co-agency going on in that whole process. The role of the descendants of Abraham in bringing divine blessing to all humanity from Genesis chapter 12 is another example. I'm going to bless everybody. They're going to be blessed in you. It's not necessarily union language, as in John. It's not an incarnation, as in John 1, when the Word became human, we're told. But Moses has a way of understanding that the fix involves a divine-human collaboration, or in my term, co-agency. Well, let me go to the Buddha here. The fix for the Buddha begins when we face the reality of suffering and the craving and the attachment which causes it, and begin the process of seeing things as they are, including seeing ourselves as we are. In the Buddha's case, there's no personal divine self, although it's possible to view the all-encompassing compassion that some Buddhist streams speak of as a near equivalent or a functional equivalent to a divine being, as long as we say that with all the qualifications and caveats that Buddhism would add about selves and beings. The aim of getting free from craving and attachment, the aim of enlightenment, as we unpacked that in the Buddha episodes, is to become compassion ourselves. Union's not the language Buddha would use, but there is a similarity between becoming compassion and the aim, according to John, of becoming love. The word union may not be used, but this is union-adjacent language, I might say. Something the Buddha offers that neither Moses nor Jesus do when it comes to the fix is that the Buddha describes in great detail what it's going to take for us to see things as they are, see ourselves as we are, right down to some of the most minute and subtle workings of consciousness itself. In other words, he doesn't just say, come to the light. He describes in very detailed ways what it's like, and in very detailed practices, how to go about it. We went into the Buddha's teaching about a lot of that when we explored the Eightfold Path, which, as the term path implies, lays out a process, a way, a journey that is, for the Buddha, the fix. It encompasses ethical things and intentions, but it also includes a process of meditation that probes the most, as I said, subtle and minute workings of the mind. This is one reason why I say I'm a Buddha meditator, because I am actively trying to follow many of the practices he taught in connection with the Eightfold Path. While the Buddha goes into far more detail about those interior workings of the fix, there are some very clear overlaps between certain ingredients in the Buddha's path and an important element of Moses' way of describing the fix. Comparison of Moses' 10 Commandments, for example, with the Eightfold Path would take us to a comparison between 3 of the Buddha's 8 in particular: right speech, right action, right living, and a comparison of those 3 with 6 of Moses' 10, particularly the last 6 commands. One of my observations is that the Buddha was much more focused than Moses on the interior dimensions of how to speak and act and make a living, for example. More focused on the interior dimensions of what Moses would have covered in his 6 commands that we would call the commands dealing with how to live as a society, live with other human beings, the final 6 of his 10 commands. The only one of Moses' commands that address the interior dimension in any way akin to the way the Buddha does is the 10th command, do not covet, which is actually talking about an inner attitude as opposed to an action. Now, of course, Moses' commands include some things that Buddhas don't. Moses' commands include specific references for how to relate to the divine, the first 4 of his 10. And that sort of thing doesn't appear at all in Buddha's 8 because Buddha isn't dealing with the divine at all. Even with these differences, my point is that both Moses and the Buddha get very practical. They each offer a set of how-tos and a framework that are part of the fix. What about Jesus? Before I answer that, I need to acknowledge the fact that by deciding to focus my Jesus episodes almost entirely on just the first 18 verses of John, I have, in a sense, left Jesus at a bit of a disadvantage, I could say. So what am I going to do about that? With both Moses and the Buddha, I included events from their lives and specifics of their teaching, neither of which have I really even begun to explore in the case of Jesus. The person that I've said is my most influential friend among the 6 that I'm going to be introducing. So to fully understand why I see him as a friend actually does require a look at some of the events in his life, and to really know if Jesus' teaching includes anything akin to the how-tos of the Eightfold Path or the 10 Commandments is going to require that I provide more direct access to the teaching of Jesus. There are 4 official versions of how his story is told. There's the 4 Gospels of what is known as the New Testament. And they each have their own way, their own ways of telling that story, their own way of ordering the events, their own way of reporting what he said, their own vocabulary preferences. So which one should I focus on if I'm going to explore some of the key events in his life and look at his teaching? While John has been profoundly influential in my understanding of who Jesus is and how he experienced the nature of God, and thus was my focus in those first episodes, there are 2 of the 4 official Gospels that I think will be more helpful at this point for looking at events in Jesus' life and aspects of his teaching. And those are these: the way the early chapters of Luke present the person of Jesus, and then the way the author of Matthew's Gospel collected and assembled the core of Jesus' teaching into one longer section known popularly as the Sermon on the Mount. So before I turn to any new friends, and next in line would be Muhammad and the Quran, I plan to go first back to Jesus. And to be honest, I haven't actually decided yet whether I'm going to start with some of the events of Jesus' life as they're described in Luke, or go to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. I guess we'll find out together next time.